Hi, I'm Alex Beam. I'm the author of Broken Glass, a recently published book about Mies van der Rohe, Dr. Edith Farnsworth, and the legendary Farnsworth House. You're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. This is the fourth year U.S. Modernist Radio has been part of the New York Architecture and Design Film Festival. If by festival you mean online, and if by New York you mean anywhere on Earth. Every fall, the authors, producers, experts, stars, and creators gather to premiere their latest architecture and design documentaries. But this year, because of COVID, executive director Kyle Bergman completely re-engineered a wildly successful in-person weekend into a compelling virtual series. Today, we talk with the people behind three of the documentaries: Royal Kennedy Rogers of Hollywood's Architect, The Paul R. Williams Story; Meredith Zielke and Yoni Goldstein of A Machine for Living; and Ned Daly of The Closer You Look. Later on, we're looking forward to a little bit of Brazilian guitar from musical guest Pat Kirtley. And now the guy who has appeared in 100 documentaries, if by 100 you mean 2, your host, George Smart.
Hi, folks. I was really thrilled and honored to be part of Fray 2, produced by Jake and Tracy Gorse, which premiered last year in Palm Springs. It's a visual rush of Fray's brilliant work around town, and the photography is just stunning, particularly the drone footage. I'm the guy in the film using a Pringles potato chip to explain hyperbolic paraboloids. But before that...
Oh, time-traveling sound effects.
It was a different time. The mid-1990s. And as I was flying through Boston, I had one of those Shirley MacLaine, Deepak Chopra woo-woo experiences where random things happen, and we love to say they are happening for some predestined mystical cause. Everything happens for a reason, right?
Sure.
In the Logan Airport bookstore, a book suddenly fell off the shelf right into my hands about the Knights Templar, an ancient order of warrior monks. And I was entranced by their story because, frankly, it just didn't add up. How could just a few guys create a massive order reporting only to the Pope? And what were they really doing in Jerusalem for those 9 years? After buying over 100 more books, spending endless time researching online, and blowing out my Visa card traveling around Europe, chasing clues of the Knights Templar, I felt compelled to produce a really badly written book. And that bad book, however, got picked up by the History Channel.
Really?
For a 2005 movie. A two-parter. I'm told they still run late at night. So if you hear my voice on the TV at 3 a.m., it's me and the Templars. For this, I received, in total, a plane ticket, a nice lobster dinner, a bagel, and a hotel room in Newport, Rhode Island, where we filmed.
Wow.
The production staff were just wonderful. And that's it, because as all documentary filmmakers except Michael Moore know, this is not a lucrative field. People are not in it for the money. These films are all labors of love. Past podcast guest and our pal Kyle Bergman curates visually wonderful, thought-provoking films that capture the brilliance of architects, artists, and significant buildings at his New York Architecture and Design Film Festival. This year's festival featured an opening night premiere about Alvar Aalto, the Frank Lloyd Wright of Finland, plus 16 other features and short films. We'll visit with 3 of them in a moment. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Wendy Robineau and Don Beskind, and by Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
Episode 6, Return of the Modernists. In our continuing imaginary space saga, Princess Angela Roll returns to her home planet of Bjarke to rescue the iconic Via 57 building, which had been moved there from Earth centuries earlier. Via 57 was under attack by classicists who really wanted a pitched roof and were busy boarding up all the windows. Princess Angela seeks out Max Vader, that's Darth's cousin, banished from the Empire for insisting Philip Johnson wasn't so bad, and together they find galactic historic tax credits. They were hidden behind a secret butler's pantry and wet bar. As Max and Angela rush down to the Planetary Planning and Zoning Board, they have no idea they are walking into a trap.
It's a trap!
And the Empire captures them inside a huge steel monolith beamed across time from Utah. With Angela and Max out of the way, the Empire can begin construction of a massive new development with homes of at least 250,000 square feet, garages not included. This certainly will spell doom for Angela's brave modernist rebels struggling to restore great architecture. Will they escape? Tune in next time. Centuries earlier, in 2021, however, you can count on Princess Angela's ancestor, funnily enough, also named Angela Roll, a real estate agent with specialized design training, advising buyers and sellers of modernist houses on everything from appropriate renovation to knowing that a parsec is a unit of distance, not time. Angela Roll is your special real estate agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Paul Revere Williams was the first African-American graduate from USC in architecture in 1919, and he was licensed as a California architect in 1921. He became the foremost black architect in America within the decade, turning out hundreds of houses large and small, especially for celebrities in L.A. We have nearly all his houses documented at usmodernist.org/pwilliams. Our first guest is Royal Kennedy Rogers, co-director and co-producer of Hollywood's Architect, the Paul R. Williams story. If you recognize her name, it's because you've seen her over the years as a reporter for ABC News or on Chicago Tonight at WTTW. Around 1977, on News Center 5, at 4:44 to be exact, you could see her advise viewers on saving money in a segment called Beat the System. She's now an independent producer in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Royal.
Thank you very much. I have to say, your research people are dangerous.
Oh, yes.
I had actually forgotten about that myself.
Well, do you still have any tips on how to beat the system?
Yeah, you got any consumer tips for us today, Royal?
Oh, my gosh, you're bringing up my past.
Well, this film, it could almost be a PBS special, huh?
Yes, it actually was. I had always had PBS in mind when I began to think about producing it, and we were fortunate enough to be accepted for distribution by our sponsoring station, PBS SoCal in Southern California.
How long did this film take you? Because I know that this couldn't have been easy or short. There was a lot of work in this, really some extensive research of your own.
Well, it did take years, and I do want to say that everything begins with Paul Williams' granddaughter, Karen Hudson. I don't know if we'd be talking about Paul Williams today if it weren't for Karen, because after her first book on him in 1996, there was a revival of interest in him, and he began to be covered in the design magazines, and you began to see more about him. That's how I heard about Paul Williams. Karen and her brother, Paul, who appear in the documentary, knew my husband from college. And Paul and my husband went to Berkeley together, and then he and Karen knew each other at Stanford. And when she began to travel the country promoting her book, we were living in Chicago, and we gave them a book party. We gave her a book party. And I couldn't believe that an African-American architect, I'm an African-American, I'm interested in architecture, I lived in Southern California, and I had never heard of him. So that's what got me thinking. I was working at the PBS station in Chicago at the time, but it was a long journey, mostly because it was my first film, and a lot of things. We had to raise our own money, and you just don't waltz into stars' homes and say, hey, we're doing a documentary. We want to bring cameras into your home. So it took literally years to get some of the stars to agree. But once they did, they were wonderful. They had a real reverence for Paul Williams.
Did the folks who had these homes, these stars, recognize the significance of the architect who designed their houses?
Yes, they absolutely did. And Steve Tisch, Robert Iger, Pauletta and Denzel Washington, and the other couples we interviewed knew exactly what they had, and they were very careful to preserve it. And in the cases that they wanted to renovate it or expand it, they used his drawings and fabricated details that were of his time, if not actually, from him. So they absolutely did. But there are stories that people live in Paul Williams' home and don't know it.
You point out in the film that Williams, despite being so successful, often couldn't either own or even walk into certain facilities that he had built.
That's absolutely true. And he actually did write about it. At the height of his career, he couldn't necessarily meet clients for lunch at the Beverly Hills Hotel unless they arrived first, or other restaurants. The neighborhoods where he built houses, there is a segment on that. He couldn't live in neighborhoods where he built houses, even at a certain point in his career when he could afford to live there. So racism is a theme that went throughout his life, but he didn't let it define him, and he certainly didn't let it get in the way of his career.
He had a number of little tricks up his sleeve, and one was drawing upside down.
That's correct. He actually talks about drawing upside down. He had clients who, I've heard the word hostile used, but that's not really the case, because if you were hostile to the idea of using an African-American, you would move on. But people were uncomfortable. He has said, his granddaughter has said that some of these people had never really worked with an African-American before on a professional level. And in most cases, a lot of times, architects will sit with you on your side of the table and lean over you, and it's a kind of an intimate relationship. And he wanted to disarm that before it even happened. So he taught himself to draw upside down, and he would seat himself at the beginning on the other side of the table. And even years later, when people were really comfortable with him, they would walk in and say, do that drawing trick. Huh. We want to see you draw upside down. So Karen Hudson speaks about that. It became a calling card.
He also had a way with people to talk about their budget up front.
Yes, this was one of our favorite stories, and I have to mention my co-producer, director, Kathy McCampbell-Vance, and our associate producer, Sherlyn Caesar, and we all worked together in doing the research on this and then all the way through the production. Yes, I loved it because he showed the kind of nerve he had. Sometimes people, Karen Hudson tells this story, who would go to, say, a party in a Paul Williams house and would love it, and they would ask the host, oh, who did your house? And they would say, oh, Paul Williams. And in the early days, before he became well-known, people would walk into his office not knowing that he was African-American. And he would say later he could see them like freeze and wonder, how can I get out of here? In the most polite way. And he would once again disarm them by saying, oh, well, why don't you just sit down and let me show you a few ideas? And he would start, and then he would say, oh, by the way, what's your budget? And if they would say, this is in the 20s, maybe the 30s, oh, $10,000 or $20,000. And he would say, oh, I'm really sorry. I am so busy. We have a policy of never accepting a commission less than $30,000. And all of a sudden, the tables were turned. He was like judging them. And Karen would say, is he saying that we're not good enough for him? And then with that and the beautiful designs, many, many times, they would end up staying. So that's one of the great stories.
Paul Williams designed a number of modernist houses, but he was mostly famous for the kinds of celebrity mansions around the Los Angeles area.
That's correct. He did what the clients wanted. And if they wanted colonial revival, he did colonial Tudor revival, a Spanish colonial revival, he did it. And if they wanted modern, he did that too. And the late house for Frank Sinatra was one of his best examples of modern. And I'm saying late because it's been torn down. It's a travesty because that house was connected to 3 icons of American culture: Paul R. Williams, Frank Sinatra, and Edward R. Murrow, because that house appeared live on the Edward R. Murrow show. I think it was called People to People. The day Frank Sinatra moved in, there's Edward R. Murrow and Frank Sinatra walking into the house. And the idea that we no longer have that house is, as I said, a travesty. One of the things that was pointed out on one of your podcasts, the Palm Springs Modernist Week, was that some people who might feel that they wanted a more traditional house in the city or Los Angeles suburbs felt they could be a little more adventurous in Palm Springs, which led to Palm Springs modernism. But he did the Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz house in Palm Springs, which was another modernist house.
Really gorgeous. I thought one of the most ironic things about learning his history was that while he was facing all of these big challenges as an African-American architect, he didn't really sign on much to the civil rights movement. He kind of stayed out of it. He was also a registered Republican, wasn't he?
That is correct. And he was a moderate Republican.
Right.
And there is a picture of him with Nelson Rockefeller. And that's one of the most unusual things, I think, that we mentioned in the documentary. However, to say that he sat out the civil rights movement is not really true.
Okay.
Karen and Paul, his 2 grandchildren, talk about how he wasn't out there on the picket lines. Their other grandfather, Dr. Hudson, was more likely to do that. But he worked behind the scenes. And a typical way that he worked behind the scenes was the founding of Broadway Federal Bank. After World War II, when African Americans couldn't get home loans from mainstream banks, Dr. Hudson and a group of businessmen got together to form a bank to give loans to African Americans. He not only designed the building, the first building and another subsequent building, I believe, but he put his weight behind it, which allowed them to go forward. It was a group, and he was probably the best-known member of that group. So in many ways, he did work behind the scenes, but not in an overt way.
It was a different kind of support
activism
for the civil rights movement. Yes.
Right.
I learned in the film that he designed the St. Jude's Hospital, which I didn't know.
Yes. And there is a lovely exchange between Karen and Marlo Thomas talking about how that whole thing came together. Paul Williams did a small renovation job, I think, for Danny Thomas. And they struck up a friendship. And Danny Thomas was one of just few clients that he actually became, really good friends with. And when Danny Thomas said, I'm going to establish this children's hospital, and I want it to be open to children of all color. And that was revolutionary. I've been told that it was the first integrated hospital in the South. They had it in Memphis. Paul Williams designed it and gave him the plans for free. And that was the beginning, the first St. Jude's building, which has been replaced by a more modern building.
But that was the start of it in a time before the Civil Rights Act.
Right. Absolutely.
Where can people see the film, Royal?
The film is now streaming on the website of our sponsoring station, PBS SoCal in Southern California. It premiered last February for Black History Month, and they're going to roll it out again to PBS stations in February for another Black History Month promotion. But right now, you can get a link to it, and you can see it streaming.
Well, Royal, thank you so much for joining us. I loved the film.
Thank you.
That was Royal Kennedy Rogers, the producer of Hollywood's Architect, The Paul R. Williams Story. Our next guest, Chicago filmmakers Yoni Goldstein and Meredith Zielke, have a new documentary, A Machine to Live In. It's a kind of hybrid documentary linking the cosmic power structures of a state to the mystical architecture of cults and utopian cities in Brazil. It's a dizzying ride assembling fragments of texts, songs, and interviews from witnesses to Brazil's Niemeyer experiment, the writer Clarice Lispector, the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the followers of linguist L.L. Zamenhof, inventor of Esperanto, and Tia Neva, Brazil's first female truck driver and charismatic cult leader.
And like past podcast guest Kobe Karp, Yoni Goldstein is from Netanya in north-central Israel, a city with lots of modernist architecture, and it was named, and I didn't know this, for a co-owner of Macy's in New York. A little trivia for you. Yoni's films have been shown in the Hot Springs Documentary Festival, Sydney Latino Film Festival, the Ann Arbor Film Festival, Globian's Doc Fest, the Cannes Film Festival, that's the big one, and the Whitney Biennial. Welcome, Yoni.
Thank you for having me.
Meredith Zilke is an international director, cinematographer, producer, and editor who works in experimental documentary and large-scale video installation. Big power bill there. She teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the Film, Video, New Media, and Animation Department. They need a shorter name. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So, Meredith, let's start with you. The film featured the architecture of Oscar Niemeyer, but it really has a number of other themes. What are some of these?
It covers a lot of themes. We in the process of producing the film and editing the film, we wanted to situate our topics kind of like in a spokes model. This is at least the way I see it, where you have a topic, which is the city of Brasilia, and then you have all of these other interdependent themes that waterfall in the background. And so we went to Brasilia every summer for 8 years, and so we folded in new material and new people and new themes every time we went. Just as one example, you'll see in the film that the poet, you'll see a children's choir, and they sing a song that's sort of a hymn or a new anthem to the city of Brasilia. And it's both celebratory and critical. And how we went about that is that we met the poet laureate of the city, whose name is Nicholas Baer, and we asked him to take all of his poems about the city and Frankenstein them together in a collage. And then we gave that script to the children's choir of the city, and then they ended up singing it.
So did somebody set it to music?
Yes. Well, it was the hymn to the city is what was the substrate of the music. And then to the tune of the hymn of the city, we gave it a whole new set of lyrics.
Wow.
Now, Yoni, for our listeners who were asleep during geography class, tell us a little bit about Brasilia and what it is to Brazil and how it got created.
Sure. The city was designed under the vision of Oscar Niemeyer, as well as Lucio Costa, and it was a city that was founded it was inaugurated in 1960, and it was one of the few cities in the world, at least kind of like in modern times, that was completely designed under the sort of one total vision of that strand of architectural modernism. So Niemeyer was a disciple of Corbusier, of course.
I got the impression in watching the film that there really is this kind of love-hate relationship between the people in the city.
Yeah. And as Meredith mentioned, we went there in the summer, which is particularly brutal under the dry, scorching heat. As you may know, the pilot plan, the major thoroughfare that Niemeyer designed, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which not only preserves the buildings themselves, but the sort of immense negative space, the empty spaces between them. And there aren't shadows. The white surfaces of the architecture is extremely reflective. In fact, there's a scene in the film that we have a conversation with an eye doctor who talks about just the immense number of cataracts that people suffer simply by the reflective light assaulting them every day.
Really?
Yeah, so there is a sense of also of scale, right? A lot of the film's photography by our director of photography, Andrew Benz, emphasizes sort of the scale, these tiny humans, these little cars in front of these sort of like vast white matte architecture, right? Sort of the signature curves and the arches and these raised structures. It really kind of creates a kind of shock to be there. And so it's in some ways it's not a very human-friendly space, but it's also, there are parts of it that are really lovely, and people do enjoy living in that city, right?
George, you mentioned that this is it seems from the film that there's a love-hate relationship with the people in the city. It's interesting because what Yoni said is true. I see lots of layers to the love-hate relationship. There's, for example, what Yoni mentioned, the architecture itself, or the idea of a city, and therefore the architecture itself affects our bodies. So that's why in the film we mentioned just the sheer reflection of the sun off of the white buildings creates cataracts. But that is something that is sort of invisible, just like we all, in whatever city we live in the world, the effect of the architecture or the ideology that created the architecture is so invisible to the effect of that on our bodies is pretty invisible to us unless you looked into it. And then the other thing is, also what Yoni mentioned is there's these vast open spaces that are protected by UNESCO that are maintained by the laborers of the city. And they're so vast that in the summer with that beating down sun, you really feel the effects of the environment on your body because there's no shade. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was because there's all of these maybe hate relationship with the city, although that's a little bit invisible, I think that the love comes from people came to Brasilia from all over Brazil to build the city. And then they settled there along with their families. And then you have the governmental elite who settled there too. So you have this mixture of people from all over the country. And because of that, Brasilia became more Brazilian over the course of time, contrary to what the visionaries wanted the place to be. And so you have these corners of the city where people play music and dance, and it's really joyous and wonderful, but that's absolutely not what the visionaries wanted to have happen. They wanted it to be chaos-free. So it's kind of interesting how things bubble over.
I mean, we love Oscar Niemeyer's work, but a classicist, our buddies the classicists, would say that this was just a completely failed experiment. That these buildings are more oddities than symbols of a strong central government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair critique, and certainly there's a symbolic weight to the architecture, and what it's conveying to you is a relationship to power and also the administration of politics, of life, of culture, agriculture, all these things as well. But I will say that we found ourselves somewhere in between these views, right? The architecture is impressive in the sense that it impresses on you certain dreams and certain visions and certain effects on your body that go beyond just like simply like everyday use structure or building. And what the film really sort of considers is the way that it inspired not only a kind of like a rational sort of modernist plan for the city, but also like a transcendental, mystical experience for the people who are living in that city, as well as the people who've come from all over the world to experience its ideas about the future, its ideas about the space age as well. We can definitely see elements of that emphasized in the way that the city presents itself.
Meredith, I wanted to ask you about your background. You've been a champion of criminal justice reform in several of your videos. Did you see a need for that in Brasilia, or have they conquered that as a culture?
Oh, wow. Well, that goes a little bit beyond what we researched for the film specifically, but I will say an interesting note of something we came across. Yeah, so I've worked on, in Chicago specifically, I worked on a number of projects that dive into the topic of criminal justice reform and incarceration and gun violence. But, what we saw in Brasilia over the course of 8 years, and we are no experts, but between the city of Brasilia and, let's say, one of our esoteric communities that we followed named Valley of the Dawn, they have a different way of handling crime. And so their judicial system is that you have to approach and confront a panel of citizens who are judges, and they judge your actions and come up with a solution, like a collectively gathered solution for how to punish you. So the punitive system is multi-pronged and approached by multiple people, and usually what it is that your punishment is to stand in their ritual gathering space with a blank notebook and gather signatures from each person who passed by. And the signatures signify a soul. And so you're basically gathering soul identities to stand behind you in whatever you did. And then once you collect all of those signatures, then you're free. And so a lot of people do flock to these communities who might have had addiction issues. They come to heal, but they also come to be set free because of their judicial and punitive system is more collectively owned.
Well, on an up note, is it still possible to skateboard around Niemeyer's buildings in Brasilia? I've seen several YouTube videos.
Oh, yeah, definitely. In some ways, right, this is the modernist landscapes have created some of the best skate parks in the world, right? And, yeah, there are definitely skateboarders. We did film them. We have this idea of considering different ways of navigating modernist cities and following skateboarders and things like that. There's a little bit of that left in the film, but we did actually shoot an entire sequence with local skater kids.
Meredith, how can people see A Machine for Living?
Well, right now, it's in between film festivals right now, but
it depends on where you are in the world. The film is currently touring the online festival circuit, and that's just the sort of product of COVID times. And once it completes its tour of the online festival world, it should be arriving one of the video-on-demand platforms. You should be able to see it. Contact us at amachine11.com, and we can also help you find a way to see the film, and we'll keep you updated.
Yoni, Meredith, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank
you so much, George.
We were just speaking with Yoni Goldstein and Meredith Zielke, producers of A Machine to Live In. Now, we turn to Ned Daly, an actor, a chef, and a Harvard-educated city planner who spent decades documenting existing conditions in large masonry and concrete structures, including buildings by Josep Louis Sert, Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier.
I love me some concrete.
His previous films include Pastiche Volume 1, Number 1, Why We Went to the Moon, and A Bang a Coup. His new film, The Closer You Look, is an abstract view of the brutalist 1971 Boston Government Services Center, designed by architect Paul Rudolph. And he's Irish, or at least half Irish, apparently. Welcome, Ned.
Hi, Ned.
Hi. Nice to be with you, George.
Hey, before we get started, I read one time you tried to swim 6 states. Were you, working your way down the coast, or what?
Boy, you guys have done your research. I have been involved with a small group of people who love swimming in the ocean, and it started with an attempt to swim at 6 beaches in 6 different states in the same day. Ultimately, we got it up to 8. We swam at beaches from Maryland to Maine between dawn and dusk on one day a couple of years ago.
Okay, but you didn't try to swim straight from one beach to the next beach.
No.
Okay.
No. We would swim, drive.
Oh, okay. So
now
a lot of wet car seats.
A lot of wet car seats. You have to be very comfortable sitting in a wet bathing suit to do these trips with me.
Now, what are the Olympic rules for this, Ned? I mean, do you have a certain number of minutes you have to be in the ocean in each state?
Well, I'll tell you, now that breakdancing apparently is going to be part of the Summer Olympics in Paris, I think we could qualify. But my own rule of thumb is that you have to be able to satisfy a Southern Baptist. One full immersion is enough, and then you can move on.
I get it.
Well, what did you discover first? The Boston Government Center as a building or the architect Paul Rudolph?
Oh, it was the building, certainly. I used to live in the north end of Boston, a nice, formerly Italian neighborhood nearby. And I walked past it all the time, and I thought, gee, this would be a great stage set or movie set. I could imagine doing a nighttime dance sequence up and down those stairs, or use it as a background for
your breakdancing video,
movie.
Yes?
Breakdance, absolutely, great breakdancing video. I just loved it. And as time went on, I had a chance to make it a movie. I always thought, I'd be the star, but in fact, the building is the star.
Tell us about that building for people that have not been there. What does it look like?
Sure. It's a very complex building. It occupies a big, what the city planners call a super block, created in the 50s and 60s as part of urban renewal programs in Boston. It's located in the middle of the government center complex. It's 2 blocks from City Hall, a block from the Federal Building, just across the way from the Center Plaza complex, which backs up to one of the courthouses. And it was never completed. I think Rudolph's original idea was to have this sort of master planned building that wrapped around 3 or 4 streets and a large central tower in the middle. The central tower never got built, and one edge of it, the edge along Merrimack Street, which is among the most complex facades, used to be even weirder and more interesting, but then they plopped a courthouse down next to it and cut off some of its strangeness.
What makes it so complex?
Well, it has a couple of users, and I think that's part of it. One of its tenants is the state unemployment office and some other state functions, the group insurance corporation. The other part of it is a mental health facility. So it's known, I think, technically as the Government Services Center, but in practical terms for the Bostonian, it's the Hurley Building where you go to file unemployment, or the Lindemann Mental Health Center where they provide mental health treatment.
This is not really an upbeat, resume for this building. I mean, this is not like the happy place.
Well, it made filming a little complicated because not only is it next to one of the big hospital complexes with sort of 24-hour street traffic, but the users of the building are those in need of unemployment assistance. I was one of them once, as well as people needing mental health services. So
well, that's me and Tom. Where can we sign up?
We don't live in Boston, but...
Ned, this building has been hated for decades by some people, a lot of people, actually. How come?
Well, I'm hard-pressed to say exactly why. I think some people don't like concrete to begin with. Boston has a great tradition of colonial, post-colonial, small-scale brick buildings, and this certainly isn't that. It has a funny aspect. The main street that it's on, Cambridge Street, big, wide artery, it only faces that in a very small way. It has a long facade down Stanford Street, the sort of exotic portions along Merrimack, and then another approach up New Chardon Street where there's the big plaza in the center where the tower was going to go. It is not a welcoming building. It doesn't have any entrances at all on the main street on Cambridge Street.
Oh.
The entrance is up a set of stairs into the plaza to the unemployment office, or through a modest entryway into the mental health facility.
So for the uninitiated, it can be a little bit hard to find where you're trying to go to, where the front door
indeed.
is.
Yes.
Now, please tell me that this is one of those modernist, brutalist buildings that really works on the inside, that nobody gets lost, that the heating and air conditioning works, that all of that is just marvelous, right?
Well, I have to say, I was inside only once, and it wasn't as part of making this film. I was inside because I was filing for unemployment. And I don't really remember much except that I had $1 in my pocket, and the next day my hack license came through so I could start driving a cab, and I never needed to collect. I would like to go inside. There's apparently a gorgeous chapel in the mental health facility. I've seen some pictures of it, but I haven't been able to see it. And in the unemployment office portion, there's apparently a wonderful mural by Constantino Nivola, which I would love to see sometime.
Well, I would think if you put in some sort of request as a filmmaker, you might be able to do that on a weekend.
Well, I did meet the building manager a couple of times as I was filming, and he seemed fairly open to my looking around inside, but that never turned out.
Okay. Now, until recently, the state wanted to, quote, with the air quotes here, redevelop this site, which we all know means tearing down all or part of it. But that has changed in early December.
I saw an article in the Boston Globe. John Chesto, who's been following this, wrote a piece announcing that they'd modified their plans. I think there's a virtual or Zoom quality public hearing coming up this week or next, at which things are going to be discussed. I don't know what the state's plan is. One of the things in reading Chesto's article and the accompanying comments, people are talking about all kinds of things like we need more density here, and this plaza is a big waste of space, and we need some high-rise towers. As a city planner, I'd have to say the coronavirus pandemic may have changed downtowns in ways we don't quite understand yet, and maybe we should wait a little bit before we decide what we're going to do with big downtown spaces.
Good point.
But the buildings themselves are not in danger at the moment, right?
No, they're not in danger. They've been under-maintained, as you can imagine. Many public buildings have been. Concrete is hard to maintain in the kind of weather we have here in the Northeast. You get really bad winters like we had in 2014-15. There were a couple of bad years back in the mid-'90s. Maintenance people can't really keep up, and their alternative is to throw down lots of rock salt, which is very, very bad for the concrete.
Yeah, that'll tear it up.
So there are a lot of areas where it's been under-maintained. They did go through a project a year or so ago, maybe a little bit more than that, while I was filming, that had to do with some additional safety improvements and ADA-required improvements.
Sounds like they just need some signs on, like, this way in.
That wouldn't hurt. That wouldn't hurt at all.
Your film, Ned, is about, 6 minutes?
5.5 minutes, yeah.
5.5 minutes?
Oh.
What did you want to accomplish with your film?
Well, I'm not much of a filmmaker, to tell you the truth, and it didn't really have a strict genre to it. I made it as kind of a meditation. I enjoyed walking around the city. I enjoyed walking around the building. I wanted to express my love for the structure and the building and see whether anybody else was interested in enjoying it with me.
Well, it's a really interesting point of view, the angles that you use to capture the building. You know, I've been there myself, and I would have never stood in those places that you were with your camera.
Well, I think that, thank you very much, I appreciate that. I think that's partly because I'm not a filmmaker like many others are. I had no investors. I had no schedule, no timetable. I was able to go shoot some footage, think about it, go back again, shoot some more footage, think about it again. An extremely inefficient way to make movies. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but it worked for me. It worked for me.
Now, where can people see the film?
Well, it has been shown at a number of film festivals in Europe and in North America. It will be shown as part of the Architecture, Design, Art Film Festival and Modernism Week in Palm Springs in February.
Okay.
Exactly what kind of venue they might have by then, I don't know. It may well be a virtual festival at that point. It has mostly been seen in these small-scale video-on-demand or film festival kind of things. It was a bad time to release new work. I'm sure that people at Sony and Disney feel even worse than I do about that, but it wasn't the greatest year to produce a new work.
Well, just be glad you're not Sony and Disney. They would have lost a couple billion by now.
Right, yeah. And I guess it's not going to go straight to HBO Max.
No, it doesn't have that kind of appeal. I think it's nice. I think it was fun to make, but it doesn't really, fit anybody's nice little niche.
Well, Ned, I appreciate your joining us. I'm looking forward to your next 5.5-minute film.
Well, thanks, George. I do want to thank my composer, Emma Campbell, who worked for free on this. She did a great job with the music. And I also want to give a shout-out to my friend Alex Beam, whose new book, Broken Glass, published by Random House, is a study of the Farnsworth House.
He was just on our show a few weeks ago.
I was just going to say.
Was he? Oh, good, good. He's a wonderful guy and a great writer.
That was Ned Daly, producer of the film The Closer You Look.
If you remember 1965, Americans were just fascinated with jet travel. This is where the phrase jet set came from, because you could hop on a plane and just jet to anywhere in 6 or 7 hours. In the Western Hemisphere, certainly, and to different parts of Europe. Before the 1960s, people jetted down to Cuba all the time. It was just a party island. It's not that kind of political statement that we think of today. It was just a place to go and have a good time, and you could jet there in a couple hours from most places on the East Coast. After the early 60s, Americans' attention turned towards Brazil, which was this very exotic place. Everybody wrote songs about it, and nearly every major recording artist released tracks with Brazilian music, usually with the English lyrics. South America was presented solely as a magical place, like Vegas, where the beaches shone by day and the parties lasted all night. Who knew that one of the brightest American stars in Brazilian guitar would hail from Kentucky, home of the Derby of the same name, Colonel Sanders, and Mitch McConnell. Pat Kirtley is a fingerstyle guitarist, composer, and guitar educator living in Bardstown, Kentucky. In the process of researching past podcast guest Eliane Elias, we came across his wonderful 2002 album, Brazilian Guitar, recorded with John Standifer. Welcome, Pat.
Hey, how are you?
So how did a boy from Kentucky discover guitar?
Well, I discovered guitar when I was about 5 years old. I heard a guy play guitar in a recording studio because my dad was a volunteer worker at this recording studio in a very small town. And he would take my brother and myself. I was 5, my brother was 4, and to get us out of our mom's hair, he would take us to the recording studio on Saturdays and Sundays when he volunteered to help work there, and we were bored to death. But one day there was this guy playing guitar, and I was not tall enough to see up over the window to see in the studio, so I didn't even know what this looked like, but I heard the sound coming over the speakers, and I said, that's what I want to do. I want to play that music and make it sound like that. So, and the guy's name was Spider Rich, who was an associate of Chet Atkins in Nashville.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, I didn't know that. All I knew was there's this guy that played guitar, and it sounded great.
What a cool dad. I guess he never went over and got you a stool so you could peek over the edge of the studio window?
Nope, never saw anything. I saw stuff that was on what at a 5-year-old's eye level, whatever that might be.
Right.
So when did you get your hands on your first acts there?
I started playing the ukulele when I was 8, and I had 2 uncles that were teaching me how to play the guitar, but my hands were too small for a guitar, but they had a ukulele. And so they started teaching me how to play the ukulele when I was 8, and I got a guitar for my birthday when I was 10.
And I understand that by 13, you were tinkering with electronics, not just using the equipment, but modifying it.
I loved electronics ever since I was a little child, and it probably started to have something to do with that recording studio, because that's all about electronics. And I eventually became a recording engineer, among other things. So the idea of electronics was just always part of my life, and I've always been an electronics guy. And so I built things and invented stuff in electronics even when I was like 7, 8 years old. And your mom pretty much doesn't like that when you're into electronics and you're that age, but I did it.
I remember that time. I went through an electronics phase pretty early on.
Yeah.
Now, I understand that there's a very rare set of recordings of you at 14 tinkering with music?
Probably. Yeah, there is. Where did you get this?
Our research team is very good.
We hear this a lot.
I would say that when I was 14, I was always into something experimental. And when I was 14, I modified a tape recorder so that it would record over top of itself, so that you could record a sound onto the tape recorder and it would loop back around and allow you to record another sound with it and then another sound with that until, you could just get a cacophony of sounds. And now it has a name. Now it's called looping.
Right.
And back then it did not have a name. And I created this machine that would do this, and it was fascinating to me. And the cool part of it was the way that it was set up. Once the tape goes through the machine and gets all this stuff recorded onto it, then it is saved. And I've still got those reels of tape with that stuff on it that I did when I was like probably 14 years old.
Wow. So you disabled the erase head.
I disabled the erase head and put another tape head. If you want to get into the mechanics of how,
he does. Believe me.
If I put another tape head out about, let's say 15 inches out from the normal tape head, the tape would be picked up by that playback head that was 15 inches out and then back through the whole thing again. And so you had a 15 inches of tape loop, but it also was continuous because it was still being picked up by the take-up reel.
Wow.
So it remembered everything that you recorded.
Did you ever listen to John Cage or Brian Eno?
At a later age, I got into especially a guy named Harry Parch.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Harry Parch invented his own symphony's worth of musical instruments. He built a symphony's worth of strange musical instruments that did not exist before that. And that guy's interesting.
What led the transition, Pat, between your being a studio engineer and a professional guitarist?
Well, from when I was a very young kid, when I was a young age, when I was growing up back in the late 50s and early 60s, and also kids go through it now, your parents tell you what you can't do. Your parents tell you that you're gonna be a so-and-so or a so-and-so, and you wouldn't want to be a musician. You wouldn't want to do that because that would be a dead end in life. And so every kid is told these things, I think, most every kid.
Yeah.
And so when I was like 16 years old and I declared to my parents, well, what do you want to be? Well, don't you want to be a scientist? You seem like you could be a scientist. No, I want to be a musician. I want to be a guitar player. Well, that's not going to work. You're going to have to go to school and you're going to have to learn something, and it's not going to be that. And so kids get programmed to do other things, and I did other things, and I don't regret it at all, and mostly it revolved around electronics. I worked as a recording engineer, and that is a burnout job. When you work in an actual studio with actual clients, and they're paying a lot of money an hour to do what they do, and they ask many things of the engineer that you wouldn't expect an employee to do, like, let's start this session at 1:30 a.m. and we'll probably go till about 5.
I make Tom do that all the time.
I know.
Yeah.
We've been up since like Saturday.
And
but yeah, I get where you're coming from.
It's a burnout job, and I loved doing it. I loved it so much. And you get to, as a recording engineer, you get to do all kinds of weird stuff. Like I got to record Tiny Tim. Oh. I might have been maybe almost the last person that recorded Tiny Tim in a studio.
Did he give you any ukulele tips?
He could actually play the ukulele very well.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
And he could do a lot of things very well. He's a very smart person, but he's a very strange person, but extremely well-read in a lot of areas. And he's a gracious person to work with. He wasn't like a bad guy in the studio. He was one of the good guys I remember from the studio.
He seemed really sweet.
This first song off the Brazilian Guitar album is Mas Que Nada, written and originally performed in 1963 by Jorge Ben. It became Sergio Mendes' signature song and was voted by Rolling Stone as the 5th greatest Brazilian song ever. It was inducted in the Latin Grammy Hall of Fame in 2013. Brazilians use Mas Que Nada or just Que Nada to disagree with someone, like we might say sarcastically, yeah, right. Here's Pat with John Standifer playing Mas Que Nada. the 1994 National Thumb Picking Contest, the 1995 National Fingerstyle Guitar Championship, and you were inducted in the National Thumb Pickers Hall of Fame. There's a lot of body parts here, so I have to ask, did KFC ever sponsor one of these? Because, you know, with finger licking good as a buzzword, I would think they would want to get involved from corporate.
Well, they did not, but I'll tell you what KFC did sponsor that very few people know about. Back in the late 70s, they created a thing. This thing was created in Louisville, Kentucky, called the Bluegrass Festival of the United States. And it was a big deal. And the major sponsor was KFC.
Oh.
So they got into finger picking good right there.
Right. Were you ever a participant?
I wasn't. At the time, you know, I wasn't working as a musician at the time. This was back when I was working as a recording engineer. Oh. And so it was always on the back burner for me. You know, I never stopped playing my guitar. I always did. And I would even have a guitar over at the side in the control room at the studio. If somebody needed a guitar lick put on to a record that, you know, and nobody else knew how to do it, I'd say, okay, I'll do that for you. And it was no big deal. But, you know, I wasn't being a touring musician or anything like that at the time, but I went to several years' worth of that festival. It was really great.
I think that's the one they moved here to Raleigh, Tom. The big Bluegrass Festival, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It could have been, but it was huge in Louisville. You know, they basically utilized the whole downtown area by the riverfront, and there was just, I don't know, thousands of people at that thing.
The International World of Bluegrass Festival, I think, is what it's called here. Mm-hmm. Of course, this year it was virtual, but it's...
Yeah, I'd say it's an offshoot of it in some way, yeah.
It's a huge thing, and yes, they take over the whole town for a week.
A couple people have asked me recently, George, why are you doing so much Brazilian music on the show lately? And it's because that in the mid-'60s, Brazilian music and other South American music really, for a while, replaced jazz inside modernist houses in the architecture. People shifted for a while to this style of music and the dancing that came with it, the bossa nova particularly. A lot of great vocalists from Brazil and also the U.S. had hit albums. And, of course, all the major recording talents of the time had Latin material in their albums. This next song is Note Samba. It's a bossa nova, and it's a jazz standard song composed by Antonio Carlos Jobim. Musicians really love this song because it's been covered by a dizzying list of jazz greats. Charlie Byrd, Duke Ellington, Rosemary Clooney, Stan Getz, the lovely Blossom Dearie, past podcast guests Stacey Kent and Eliane Elias, Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie, Vince Guaraldi of Peanut Theme fame, Quincy Jones, the musician, not the architect, Al Jarreau, and even Sinatra. Here's Pat Kirtley and John Standifer with Note Samba.
there's more than one note in that, I think.
There is a lot more. I think that's the joke about that song. It uses every note in the dictionary.
Nice work.
The melody is based on one note and based on chord variations that incorporate that one note. So that's a great expansion of chords right there. But then the rest of the song, it just goes all over the place, and there's like many, many notes in it. So that's the irony of it. But what a great tune. And something I remembered while I was listening to that just now, there's a guitar sound in there that sounds a little bit more metallic and more forward than a regular nylon string guitar. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
That is actually a Brazilian guitar. This is John Standifer playing a guitar that's called a Del Vecchio guitar. They're made in Brazil. They were invented in Brazil, and it's a very distinctive sound, and it's used a lot in music, certain types of music, but it's a true Brazilian instrument.
Well, Pat, I'm happy every time I hear this song. It just makes me feel a little joy in my heart.
Yeah.
It's really super. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist houses, and by Wendy Robineau and Don Beskin.
Visit USModernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 8,000 significant modernist houses, and access 3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Carrie Cesarino researches guests while juggling 9 chickens in her backyard, 2 above-average children chasing those chickens, and a shockingly handsome husband constantly flipping her circuit breaker.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another woefully underfunded, horribly underpaid, labor of love architecture documentary film edition with one note only of U.S. Modernist Radio.